Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today as we're continuing our unit here on modern America and really focusing very heavily on this unit, kind of America through the eyes of the president, because it's very chronological and it's a lot easier in history when you get closer to present day to kind of look at the reflection that America gives of itself with who they elect and how they work with them. Today we're going to talk about George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush did a whole bunch of really good stuff while he was the president, pretty effective, solid president, then loses his re-election bid, which is pretty rare. We're going to look at how that happened today. Let's get started. So Ronald Reagan is loved in 1988. He can't run for a second term, so he's going to have his vice president, George H.W. Bush, run instead, and he gives him his endorsement. Before we talk about him, because we are kind of getting into more modern stuff, and you may be curious as to what happened with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan passed away in 2004. It was a huge thing. There's a lot of supporters of Ronald Reagan. He's by far the most popular president that we had, that we'll talk about this unit up to present day when this is being recorded. So in 1994, after he'd been out of the presidency for 6 years, he's diagnosed with Alzheimer's and battles that for for a decade, and then passed away in 2004 from it. So I want to give you a follow-up of kind of what happened to some of the more modern presidents and where they are today as of this recording, and Ronald Reagan has passed away. I also want to point out, when we talk about George Bush today, there are two George Bushes in this unit. The guy on the right here, that I'm probably blocking, the guy on the right, this is the guy we're going to talk about today. This is George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. The guy to his left, the younger guy, the younger George Bush, is his son. Both of these men are going to be the president during this unit, and they're both going to fight a war with Iraq against a guy named Saddam Hussein. So I want to go ahead and point that out there. So you got to, like, very different stories, different men, different situations while they're in office, but I do want to point that out so you don't get confused. There are two George Bushes. I will try my hardest to always refer to the senior George Bush, either as senior George Bush or George H.W. Bush, where his son is George W. Bush. Anyway, so in 1988, George H.W. Bush is the vice president under Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is not going to run for his second term in office, so he supports George Bush, George H.W. Bush, being the president. Well, he's not just automatically given the ability to be the president, like automatically. He does have to run for it. So during Reagan's time in office, he basically let everybody have their cake and eat it too. And everybody was cool with this because they loved Reagan. Basically, he didn't tax anybody, and he spent a ton of money on the military. The Cold War is pretty much over. The Soviet Union is going to actually collapse while George H.W. Bush is the president here. But George H.W. Bush still has to say something assertive so that everybody believes in him. And what he says, which is going to come back to haunt him, is he says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And he says it all the time. It is his campaign slogan. People love the fact that they didn't have to pay any taxes under Reagan. That figuratively, the taxes were lower. And George H.W. Bush is like, we're going to continue that. The issue, though, and I need to point this out, George H.W. Bush is much more a policy guy than Reagan was, and is going to realize pretty soon you can't keep spending money and not bringing money in. Something has to change. Either we stop spending money or we have to bring more in. And he's going to have to spend money because there's going to be some war. But in 1988, saying "read my lips, no new taxes" is all he had to say, and George H.W. Bush is going to win huge in 1988. So he comes in, he's got the support, everything's going well. Spoiler alert, he's going to be a one-term president and be voted out of office, and he's going to be pretty unpopular when he leaves. And you're like, ooh, we're going to have some scandals here. He's going to do something crazy. There's going to be none of that happens. Which is really interesting in history, the fact that George H.W. Bush is actually a pretty solid president. I mean, he's going to be in the upper half of presidents. And he gets very unpopular at the end, and we'll talk about it at the very end, because everything we're going to talk about here is going to appear at the time that he should be popular, and he was. Anyway, before I keep confusing you, let's go on here. Why did George H.W. Bush have to convince voters there would be no new taxes? What did they like, and what do they want to continue having? So don't overthink this one. Answer that completely, and we're moving on. So there's a situation while in Bush's term in Panama. Now, I got to give you a little backstory here to understand this. And this is actually something that started while Reagan was president. The use of illegal drugs in the United States, from crack cocaine, down to regular marijuana, is considered like public enemy number one kind of thing. And they really want to crack down on drug use, illegal drug use in the United States in the 1980s. There is all types of programs aimed at kids to keep kids from using drugs. I, being old enough, went through the DARE program, and it was, man, like, being around drugs, like, is like I couldn't even exaggerate. Now, obviously, there's clearly issues with drug abuse in the United States and human nature in general, but it was crazy in the 80s and the 90s because not only are they trying to prevent people from getting on drugs with stuff like DARE, which helped out kids, drug abuse resistance education, helped kids understand drugs, like the negative side effects. Sometimes they were exaggerated, which will then later on people will realize that, wait, if they lied to us about it, what else are they lying to us about? But it was to prevent this epidemic people thought was going to happen and was happening in the United States with the use of illegal drugs. So not only are they trying to prevent people from starting to use drugs, they drastically increase the punishments if you're caught with drugs. Being caught with marijuana is a felony, and you go to prison for that. Not surprisingly, the prison population is going to skyrocket starting in the 1980s with the war on drugs, with people that... So there are states that have like 3 strike laws. If you get 3 felonies, you just go to prison for life. If you're caught with marijuana, even the smallest itty bitty amounts, 3 separate times, life in prison. Today, because the American views on marijuana have pretty drastically changed from the 1980s, it's wild to imagine it. It's almost like thinking about in Prohibition of people going to prison for alcohol, while you understand what maybe the idea was to prevent the abuse of alcohol. It still seems wild in today's society. So I got to paint that picture. It is the war on drugs. Drugs are number one enemy. All right. So that brings us to George Bush's time in office in a country called Panama. We had talked about the Panama Canal. All right. It's down below Mexico. Panama has a dictator, a guy named General Manuel Noriega. All right. So one of the ways Panama makes money is they sell drugs in the form of cocaine, and then cocaine can be turned into crack cocaine, which is, again, America's enemy number one. It was a constant battle, the influx of drugs from these countries into the United States illegally. America would seize all these drugs. I think this is actually a more recent picture. It's a Shutterstock picture. I think this is clearly newer than this time period. I just want to show you like drug bust and drugs coming in from Panama. So George Bush is like, not cool, General Manuel Noriega. And he goes to Manuel Noriega and basically calls him out on the fact that they are shipping these drugs to America in order to fund their country. And the conversation basically goes, hey, General Manuel Noriega, are you shipping drugs to America? Now, Manuel Noriega has a whole bunch of different responses he could have here. He could say, no. He could be like, yes, my bad. I won't do it anymore. Or he could say, yeah, so what? I'll legalize it. That's your problem, not mine. He could say any of those things, and it would not be nearly as dumb on his part than what he actually does. General Manuel Noriega, look at this man in the face when I tell you this, responds by declaring war on the United States. So the Cold War pretty much has just ended. We have a massive standing military and nothing to do with it. We're like, cool. And when we get, Manuel Noriega in Panama declares war on us, America, as an extension of this war on drugs, we invade Panama with our military. This war lasts about a day. We go through any of Noriega's troops. Anybody tries to stand up against America, it's really no match for the superior American military. And we capture Manuel Noriega. This is a huge win for the war on drugs. And Manuel Noriega is arrested and he's sent to Florida, in a Florida prison. He is sentenced to 30 years in a Florida prison. This was a dictator. He was actually, and I was just doing this research on what has currently happened with Manuel Noriega. I didn't even know this. He was actually released in 2007. He served like 17 years of his 30-year sentence. Because they then shipped him back to Panama, because Panama has moved on from this dictator, and they basically put him on trial for like war crimes and the stuff he did to their own country. France also had a big problem with him, and so they're like, all right, Panama, whenever you're done with your 100-year sentence or whatever you have for him, send him over to us, and we will also put him in prison. He actually dies in 2007. He gets a brain tumor and dies of natural causes, being a brain tumor, in a Panamanian prison. But this is very symbolic of the war on drugs. Literally leads us to actually like international battles because of America's desire to clean up the streets and get the drugs off the streets. It really wasn't effective. And we didn't know that at the time. The idea was if you really increase these prison sentences for drug use, it will prevent people from doing drugs. However, on the harder stuff like cocaine, crack, addiction is no joke, and putting people in prison doesn't help the addiction crisis that was happening, that we've kind of learned from that. Also, for marijuana, treating it the same thing as crack is just, we look back on it and we're like, probably wasn't the best solution to that. So the question here is, how did the war on drugs affect both domestic and foreign policy during George H.W. Bush's time in office? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right. So we fight a straight up war in the Middle East, and this one goes differently than most wars in the Middle East. And again, this is to me is actually shocking that George H.W. Bush doesn't win re-election. So here's what happens. We're going to start here with Iraq. All right. So Iraq is in the center of the Middle East. So if you notice, Iraq doesn't have a lot of ports. They have just tiny little bitty port. All right. There is a country that is below them, but it's like to the bottom right, called Kuwait. So Iraq has oil. That's how a lot of these Middle Eastern countries make money. Kuwait, while it is a small country, they have a lot more ports. They have more access here to the Persian Gulf. Kuwait is also sitting on massive oil reserves, and Kuwait is a very rich country. All right? But back to Iraq. Iraq has a dictator. He's a turd. Nobody in Iraq likes this guy. This is Saddam Hussein. He rules with an iron fist here in Iraq. So everybody in Iraq is Muslims, and there's different versions of Muslims, but they all equally hate Saddam Hussein. But nobody's going to stand up to him because the dude is intensely controlling of Iraq. All right. So what ends up happening, and here's another map. Iraq is here in green, and Kuwait is here in orange. Saddam Hussein builds a huge army. All right. And he just one day in 1990 he invades Kuwait just to take it over so that he has their ports and he has their oil fields. And just it catches kind of the Middle East off guard when on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq just launches a massive invasion into Kuwait. The rest of the Middle East is horrified by this because this dude is like taking over other Middle Eastern countries. He has the largest military. What are we going to do? And there's a big panic. So the Middle East, the rest of the Middle East, knowing Saddam Hussein is just going to start taking over different countries, almost Hitler style, then turns to the United States and says, America, can you come help us? So America, oh, we love this. The reason we care so much about the Middle East is because of oil. And these countries have a bunch of oil and they're asking for American help. Usually they don't want America to show up, but here they're like, America, come help us. So America has learned though, all right? We can't just race in and start fighting people because we don't want what happened in Vietnam to happen. The first thing that we do is we go to the UN Security Council. We do it straight up official. And this is all Bush's decision. Instead of just running in there and doing it on our own, we go to the UN Security Council and we say, hey, are y'all cool if we go in here and help out Kuwait? Right? Because that's what people want. They want to help Kuwait. The UN Security Council here agrees that the UN can go in and help out Kuwait, which really just means America gets the okay by the world to go use military force in Kuwait to kick out Saddam Hussein and his troops. We are not really licensed here to invade Iraq, to clarify. We can go in and kick out the Iraqis in Kuwait. To prevent another Vietnam, and like trying to go into South Vietnam and kick out the North Vietnamese in South Vietnam, we want to make sure that doesn't happen again where the South Vietnamese are like, no, leave us alone. So we're like, all right, Kuwait, y'all want the, you guys want Saddam Hussein out, right? And they said yes. And we're like, okay. Now we're not going to get there and then be a whole bunch of like Kuwaiti people who actually want to be taken over by Saddam Hussein is going to be fighting against us. And they're like, no, we don't like this turd. Get him out of here. So we're like, okay. And then George Bush makes sure to the American people was like, hey, are y'all cool with this? Because we'll go here and do it. If you say no, we won't. Knowing how unpopular the war was in Vietnam, George Bush asked permission, basically, and make sure the American people support this. And the American people are like, yes, because you know what's happening? Gas prices are skyrocketing because nobody knows what's going to happen to the oil in the Middle East. So Americans like, yes, go in so that gas prices go down. And George Bush is like, say no more. He has the support of the UN, he has the support of Kuwait, and he has the support of the American people. Let's do it. So the question here is, what did America and Bush learn from Vietnam, and how is the Persian Gulf War approached differently? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So this brings us to Operation Desert Storm. This is, I don't know if how familiar you are with this. Massive invasion of Kuwait by America. So this is a picture of George Bush meeting with the troops in the Middle East. So America goes and sets up shop in Saudi Arabia. So like the Middle East is happy when our military shows up. That typically doesn't happen. Like, yay, you're here to save us. So we set up shop in a neighboring country in Saudi Arabia. And then we are going to invade Kuwait to kick out the Iraqis that have invaded it. So this is the American military rolling into Kuwait. Now, this war is going to go very well for America. I mean, it's a slobber knocker. I think we lose less than 100 soldiers in the very first attacks, especially in the fighter jet situations, which I'll talk about in a second. It is a huge undertaking to invade Kuwait. But what's the big difference in this and Vietnam is America is attacking the soldiers from Iraq that are wearing Iraqi uniforms, and they are no match for the American firepower. So our tanks and troops don't actually see a bunch of action in Persia because it's a wide open desert. We just send in our planes. There's nowhere to hide. So our planes just go in first, and we have now like laser guided missiles. We're super accurate. Things have gotten way more advanced than Vietnam, which is 20 years before this. We don't miss, there's not anything close, even a fraction of like the civilian casualties that were happening in Kuwait. So America goes in and just pap, 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 just annihilates the Iraqi military, and very quickly Saddam Hussein has lost and has to turn around and retreat away from Kuwait. To show you how big of a jerk Saddam Hussein is, all right? And this is important because we're going to talk about him again with another president. Saddam Hussein, when he leaves Kuwait, he's like, if I can't have these oil fields in Kuwait, nobody else can. And he goes through and sets all the oil fields here in Desert Storm, in Kuwait. He sets them on fire. It's supposed to take like 6 years or something to put these fires out. We put them out in like 3 months because America really wants their oil. The thing is, we could go take out Saddam Hussein at this point. Legally, during the war, we could take out Saddam Hussein. Even after Operation Desert Storm, if we wanted to roll into Iraq, we could take out Saddam Hussein and probably wouldn't suffer any international discipline for it because this dude's clearly a jerk and he's a dictator. George Bush makes the conscious decision not to chase him into Iraq and take him out. There's a handful of reasons for that. Number one, that wasn't really what we were asked to go in there and do. We were asked to go in there and defend Kuwait, which we did. If we expand the war, it's going to make us look overly aggressive to the Middle East. We don't want that. The Middle East is very happy with us right now. We don't want to appear overly aggressive here and then make them not like us, therefore gas prices go up. So George Bush decides not to chase him into Iraq. The second reason is we wiped out his army. That's really the only thing protecting him from all his people. And there's a lot of people in Iraq that do not like Saddam Hussein. We are very confident as a country that Saddam Hussein is going to get taken out of power by his own people one way or other, and that we don't really have to get involved in it. That ends up not being the case, surprisingly, because we are going to have to deal with him in about 10 years after this when George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, is president, and there's a whole nother issue which is not quite as legitimate as this war. But the question here is, explain the strategic reasons why America decided not to take out Saddam Hussein in Iraq after Operation Desert Storm. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So it's 1991. 1992, George H.W. Bush is going to run for re-election. In 1991, at the end of this war, his approval rating is 89%. That is ridiculous. That is crazy high. How in the world does George Bush, who is this, well, I mean, the Cold War ended, the war on drugs looks like it's a success, ends up, that's a long-term thing that doesn't affect him politically at the time. We go into the Middle East likes us, gas is cheap, and then his approval rating is going to plummet. Like, what did he do? Did he stab somebody? No. His approval rating is going to go from 89 in 1991 all the way down to 29 and right before the election. So wow, like even he is like, what is the problem here? And so James Norville is a political pundit, and he says this thing in 1992, and it has stuck. It's the economy, stupid. That was the problem. The economy wasn't doing great. You can win all the wars, but when people stop having jobs and prices go up and wages are going down, that's a problem. You can see here, this is the unemployment rate. So you don't want this to go up. All during Reagan's time in office, the unemployment rate dropped. Well, during George Bush's time in office, it starts going up, all right? The economy isn't doing well. So not only is the economy not doing well, and George Bush really hasn't done anything for the economy, which affects everybody intensely, he made this statement: read my lips, no new taxes. Well, we just fought 2 wars. Those aren't free. So George Bush had to raise taxes. This killed him in the election. Not only is the economy doing bad, all they had to do, and I was old enough at the time, I was about 10, wasn't quite, I was 9, and I actually remember this commercial because I remember commercials from back then. And it was, the commercial was him saying, read my lips, no new taxes. And then it just started listing all the taxes that he had created. And because of that, he loses a lot of popularity. There's also a unique situation in 1992 when he runs for re-election. He is going to run against a guy named Bill Clinton, who is a Democrat. All right? There hadn't been a Democrat in office since Jimmy Carter. So he's going to run against Bill Clinton. There is also a third-party candidate that's going to run, a guy named Ross Perot. It looks like Ross Perot, but it's pronounced Perot. Ross Perot is going to run. He is a oil billionaire from Texas, and he basically says, if you elect me, I'm going to run America like a business, all right? Because that's what people wanted. They wanted more jobs, and the idea of running America like a business is a positive. He's not going to win. However, the people that vote for Ross Perot, if he wasn't running, would have voted for George Bush instead. Ross Perot really took a lot of votes from George Bush, which allowed Bill Clinton to win. So in 1992, Bill Clinton here in the middle and his vice president to the right, that's Al Gore, they're going to win in 1992. The economy crushed George Bush's re-election chances. Also, Ross Perot stole valuable votes for him. I think there's a good chance if Ross Perot didn't win, George H.W. Bush could have squeaked out a second term. But to be a president that is that wildly popular a year before the election and to lose and not have any big scandal or anything like that, there's really no precedent for that in American history. So the question here is, explain what happened that caused George H.W. Bush to become unpopular at the end of his term and ultimately lose his re-election bid. So answer that completely. Pause me if you need to. That's what I got for you guys today. We'll pick up here tomorrow with Bill Clinton.